Section: Introduction. We, as a team, are diving into the world of transformers and generalized state space models, GSSMs, which are at the forefront of sequence modeling. Transformers have been incredibly successful in various tasks but come with a significant drawback. They require a lot of memory and computing power to predict the next part of a sequence, which grows with the sequence's length. This challenge has led to the exploration of models that can perform similarly but use a fixed amount of memory for each prediction, including state space models like S4 or Mamba, traditional RNNs, and models that can be trained in parallel like linear attention and parallel RNNs. We refer to these as GSSMs throughout our paper. Recent studies have shown that GSSMs can be quite effective, but it's not entirely clear what, if anything, they give up in exchange for their efficiency. Our research has found that GSSMs are less capable of retrieving and repeating parts of the input, a task at which transformers excel. This is particularly evident in tasks that require accessing various parts of the context. To get a better understanding of this difference, we start with a theoretical analysis of the copying task. We demonstrate that a simple transformer can copy strings whose length is exponentially larger than its size, thanks to its ability to store and retrieve sequences of tokens. On the other hand, GSSMs struggle with copying strings longer than the size of their latent state, essentially because they can't store as much information. While our theory focuses on what these models could theoretically represent, we also explore whether GSSMs can learn to represent complex inputs in practice. To do this, we conduct experiments with models having around 160 million parameters. Our findings show that transformers are not only more efficient at learning to copy but also better at handling longer inputs. Moreover, we confirm that the copying mechanism learned by transformers relies on retrieving sequences of tokens, similar to our theoretical expectations. Additionally, we run experiments on pre-trained models to see how well they can remember and access input context. Here, we find that Pythia transformers outperform Mamba GSSMs in memory-intensive tasks like copying and retrieving information, even though Mamba models perform better in language modeling tasks on specific datasets. These results highlight the importance of memory capabilities in models and suggest that architectural choices can significantly affect a model's performance beyond just training efficiency. In the theory section, we compare state space models and transformers using the copy task. We prove two main points. First, that a small transformer can solve the copy task for sequences much longer than its size, and second, that state space models can't solve the copy task unless their latent state size increases with the sequence length. We also clarify the setting for our comparison, using a dictionary of tokens and defining sequence to sequence and sequence to token models. For GSSMs, we explain how they work using an update rule and an output function, starting from an initial state and processing input sequences to produce outputs. It's important to note that when we talk about memory in GSSMs, we're referring to the memory needed to store the model state, which is separate from the memory used for the model's parameters or the computation needed to update the state. This distinction helps us focus on the limitations of GSSM's memory for storing information about the input sequence. Section Summary. Transformers are highly efficient for sequence modeling but require significant memory and compute resources, leading to the development of generalized state space models, GSSMs, aiming for similar performance with lower memory requirements. However, GSSMs sacrifice the ability to retrieve and repeat parts of the input context, making transformers better at tasks requiring access to arbitrary parts of the context. Theoretical analysis and synthetic experiments demonstrate that transformers are more efficient at learning to copy and generalize better to longer inputs, highlighting the practical relevance of memory issues and the impact of architectural choices on performance. Section: Transformers. We're going to talk about transformers, a type of model that deals with sequences of data. Imagine you have a sequence of items, each with a certain length, L, and each item is represented in a space of dimension, D. These items are represented as x_1, x_2, x_L, and each one lives in a D dimensional space. In a transformer, there's a concept called an attention head, which helps the model to focus on different parts of the input sequence. Each attention head has its own set of parameters, represented by matrices W_K, W_Q, and W_V, each of which transforms the input data in a specific way to get what we call keys, K, queries, Q, and values, V. We use these transformed inputs to calculate the output of the attention head for each item in the sequence. A transformer model can have multiple attention heads, let's say, L of them, each working in parallel. The total dimension of the transformer is then D times L. The model also includes embeddings, which are ways to map input data into the D dimensional space, and an MLP, multi-layer perceptron, which is a type of neural network that processes the combined outputs of all attention heads. An attention block in a transformer consists of these L attention heads working together, and a transformer block is an attention block followed by an MLP. The final output of the model is based on the output of the last layer, and for simplicity, we focus on choosing the most probable next item in the sequence. Now, let's talk about a specific task called the copy task. To do this, we add two special tokens to our input, a beginning of sequence token and a copy token. The goal is for the model to output an exact copy of the input sequence when it sees these tokens. We measure the model's performance by how often it fails to copy the input exactly. Interestingly, we show that transformers can copy input sequences that are exponentially long in relation to the number of attention heads. We achieve this through a method we call hash-based copying, where we first create a hash of sequences of tokens and then use this hash to help the model remember and copy the sequence. To make this hashing work, we use a special technique for embedding positional information called hard alibi. This involves adding a bias to the attention mechanism, which helps the model use the position of tokens to better perform the hashing and copying. This technique not only helps in our theoretical construction but also shows practical benefits. In summary, we've discussed how transformers work, focusing on their ability to perform a copy task through a novel method of hash-based copying and the use of a special positional embedding technique. This demonstrates the flexibility and power of transformers in handling sequences of data. Section Summary. The section discusses the use of transformers in implementing the copy task for input sequences with exponential length. It introduces the construction of a transformer with two blocks that achieves low error on the copy task by hashing sequences of tokens and attending to previous occurrences of n-grams. Additionally, it mentions the use of hard alibi, a bias added to the attention heads, to leverage local positional information for defining a hash and applying it globally on the entire input. Section Guarantees. We've developed an algorithm, and similarly, a way to build transformers that can perfectly replicate the input sequence as long as the input doesn't have any repeating patterns of n tokens. The chance of making a mistake with this algorithm is tied to how likely it is to find these repeating patterns, which we call repeated n-grams, in the input. Let's talk about a specific scenario where we're trying to copy a sequence. We define a term called the copy distribution for sequences of a certain length. For any given length and a specific number of tokens n, we can calculate the probability that a sequence will have two identical sets of n tokens somewhere within it. Our main finding is that transformers can indeed replicate their input with a very small chance of error, and this error is directly related to the likelihood of encountering repeated n-grams. Specifically, for any given n, there's a transformer with two layers and a certain size that can copy sequences within a specific length range almost perfectly, as long as the sequences come from our defined copy distribution. The error made by this transformer is less than the probability of finding repeated n-grams in the sequence. Interestingly, as we choose larger values of n, the chance of finding these repeated n-grams drops off quickly. For sequences that are randomly generated from a set of tokens, which we call the uniform distribution, this probability decreases exponentially with n. This means that transformers can replicate sequences from this uniform distribution very efficiently, needing only a small increase in size based on the logarithm of the sequence length. For a more practical perspective, if we set a very small error margin and choose a sequence length based on this margin, we can design a two-layer transformer of a certain size that will copy sequences from the uniform distribution with an error smaller than our set margin. It's worth noting that we're assuming the transformers can use parameters and activations with infinite precision. However, our findings still hold even if we limit ourselves to finite precision, requiring only a small increase in the number of bits as the sequence length grows. When we compare transformers to general state space models, GSSMs, in terms of copying ability, we find that GSSMs fall short unless they can increase their memory size linearly with the sequence length. This is because to copy a sequence perfectly, a model needs to store the entire sequence in its memory, and for GSSMs, this means their memory size must grow with the sequence. If a GSSM has a state space smaller than a certain threshold, it will make errors on more than half of the sequences from the uniform distribution. This comparison highlights that, at least for the task of copying, transformers are nearly optimal in how they use memory to handle input sequences, achieving close to the best possible performance with only a linear increase in memory use, adjusted for some logarithmic factors. Moving on to the practical implications, our theoretical analysis suggests that transformers should be better at copying long sequences than GSSMs, which have limited memory. However, it's not immediately clear if transformers can learn this copying ability from examples, or if GSSMs might perform better than expected with larger latent state memories in real-world tasks. To explore this, we conducted experiments by training both transformers and GSSMs on a copy task with synthetic data. This step helps us understand if our theoretical findings hold up when we apply these models to actual data. Section Summary. The section discusses the guarantees of transformers in copying input sequences and compares them with gated state space models, GSSMs. It highlights that transformers can copy sequences of tokens drawn from the uniform distribution using a number of parameters that depends only logarithmically on the input sequence length, while GSSMs cannot copy uniform input sequences unless the capacity of their state space grows linearly with the size of the sequence length. The theoretical analysis is aimed at verifying the practical performance of transformers and GSSMs in copying tasks before studying pre-trained models. Section: Experimental Setup. We're going to give you a simplified overview of how we set up our experiments. You can find more detailed information in the appendix section dedicated to experiments. For our experiments, we made sure that both the Mamba models and the transformer models had a similar number of parameters, around 160 million. We tried to use large LSTMs as well, but they were difficult to train. The largest LSTM we could successfully train had about 40 million parameters. When it came to the data we used for training, we created a batch of 64 examples for each training epoch. For testing, we evaluated our models on 10 batches, each containing 128 examples, and we calculated the average and the standard deviation of the results over these batches. Unless we state otherwise, the set of tokens we used was made up of 30 items, including all the letters of the alphabet, a beginning of sentence token, an end of sentence token, and a separator token. We chose the strings randomly, first deciding on their length and then picking each character independently from our set of tokens. During training, we also included a variety of independent task samples to enrich the context, similar to previous studies. Positional information turned out to be quite important for our models, especially for the transformers, to understand and generalize the length of sequences. Instead of using the traditional methods of adding positional information, like sinusoidal or learned embeddings, we used relative positional encodings in each attention layer. We experimented with several types of these encodings, including a new one we introduced called hard alibi encoding. We started our experiments with a simple task where the model had to copy a sequence of input tokens. We trained our models on sequences of random lengths up to 300 tokens and then checked how accurately they could copy these sequences. The results showed a significant difference between transformers and generalized state space models, GSSMs, with transformers needing far fewer examples to learn the task. We noticed that the accuracy changes were more pronounced due to the way we plotted the results and the metric we chose. When we looked at character-level accuracy, the learning process appeared smoother. LSTMs, in particular, struggled with sequences of 300 characters, though they performed better on shorter sequences, indicating that string length was a major challenge. Next, we wanted to see how well our models could apply what they learned to sequences longer than those they were trained on. We trained all models on sequences up to 50 tokens long and then tested them on sequences up to 1000 tokens long. The transformers were much better at handling these longer sequences compared to the GSSMs. Specifically, the performance of GSSMs dropped significantly with longer inputs, while transformers showed a more gradual decline. Lastly, when comparing different transformer models, we found that the type of positional encoding used had a big impact on how well they could generalize to longer sequences. The alibi and nope models performed much better on longer inputs than the rope model, likely because the sinusoidal embeddings used by rope resulted in more dramatic changes with longer inputs. Section summary. The experimental setup involved training models with similar numbers of parameters and evaluating them on a copy task, where transformers showed significantly better efficiency and generalization compared to GSSMs. The positional encoding, particularly alibi and nope transformers, played a crucial role in length generalization, outperforming the rope model on longer inputs due to their less dramatic change with longer sequences. Section. Improved generalization with hard alibi. We wanted to understand how transformers learn to replicate information, so we decided to use a special kind of positional encoding called hard alibi, which we had previously discussed. When we trained a transformer with this hard alibi encoding on short sequences, up to 50 tokens, we found it could accurately replicate sequences as long as 1000 tokens, which is much longer than anything it saw during training. Next, we explored whether the transformer was actually storing and retrieving short sequences of tokens, known as n-grams, to accomplish the copy task. We tested the transformer by giving it sequences that had repeated n-grams, to see if it could still perform well. The results showed that the transformer did well with duplicates of up to 4 tokens, but its performance dropped with longer repeated sequences. This suggests that the transformer might be using a method similar to retrieving 5-token sequences to copy information. We also introduced a new task to further investigate how models copy information. This task required the model to find and output a specific sequence of tokens, a key, that followed a given n-gram in the input. We tried 2 versions of this task, one where the key comes after the n-gram, suffix key, and one where the key comes before it, prefix key. The transformers did well on the suffix key task, indicating they can store and retrieve n-grams effectively. However, generalized sequence-to-sequence models, GSSMs, struggled with this, likely because they have a harder time storing the entire input sequence. On the other hand, in the prefix key task, where the model could look for the key as it read through the sequence, GSSMs performed much better, even outdoing some transformers. This suggests that GSSMs can work well when they don't need to remember the whole input. Lastly, we compared pre-trained transformers and GSSMs on tasks that require a good memory, like copying long texts, retrieving specific information, and answering questions based on a given text. Transformers generally did better than GSSMs, even when the GSSMs were more efficient in processing language, as shown by lower perplexity. This confirms that GSSMs have limitations in memory-intensive tasks, which we had observed in our earlier experiments. In our experiments, we compared different models by looking at how well they could copy texts or retrieve information from them, using various lengths of input. We used a dataset called the pile and the same tokenizer for all models. We found that transformers were more effective at these tasks than GSSMs, highlighting the importance of model design in handling memory-intensive tasks. Section summary. The section discusses the use of hard alibi positional encoding in transformers to achieve almost perfect length generalization for sequences up to length 1000, indicating the ability to use n-gram hashing for the copy task. It also explores the performance of transformers and GSSMs in n-gram lookup tasks, revealing that transformers can effectively perform n-gram storage and retrieval, while GSSMs struggle beyond their training distribution due to memory limitations. Additionally, the comparison between pre-trained transformers and GSSMs on memory-intensive tasks confirms that transformers outperform GSSMs, even when the latter has lower perplexity as a language model. The experiments involve comparing Pythia transformer models with Mamba models, both pre-trained on the pile, and evaluating their performance on copy-based and information retrieval tasks. Section: Copying the input context. We've noticed that pre-trained transformer models are better at copying long strings of natural language than pre-trained GSSMs, generalized state space models. To test this, we used strings of different lengths from the C4 dataset. Our test involved giving the model 2 copies of a string plus the first word of it and asking the model to complete the third copy. Even the smallest transformer model did much better than the biggest GSSM. This was true even though the large GSSMs should technically have enough memory to store the context. This shows that transformers have a built-in advantage that makes them better at copying from the context. We also found that natural text, which can often be compressed, allows language models to copy longer strings even with limited memory. To see if this compression ability mattered, we mixed up the order of words in the strings and repeated our test. Both GSSMs and transformers did worse with the mixed-up strings, but GSSMs were affected more severely. The largest GSSM couldn't accurately copy strings longer than 300 words at all when the words were shuffled. This suggests that GSSMs struggle more when the input is harder to compress due to their fixed memory size. Copying is a simple task, but it's an extreme example of a behavior that's very important for many real-world tasks. These tasks often involve pulling specific information from the context that's relevant to what's being asked. We looked at how our findings apply to more practical tasks. In a phone book experiment, we asked models to find a phone number given a name from a synthetic phone book we created. Even the smallest transformer model was better at this than the largest GSSMs, especially when the phone book was large. This shows that for tasks requiring access to a lot of context, GSSMs struggle because they can't store all the relevant information in their fixed memory. In a question-answering experiment using the SQUAD dataset, we compared a 2.8 billion parameter GSSM model and transformer models. While both types of models did similarly well with short paragraphs, the GSSM model's performance dropped off more with longer paragraphs, whereas the transformer model's performance remained steady. This again shows that GSSM's fixed memory limits their effectiveness on standard tasks. There's a lot of previous research on the capabilities of GSSMs, like RNNs, and transformers. Some studies compare transformers to other models to understand their complexity. However, these studies don't explain how transformers solve specific problems. Our work, on the other hand, shows through the example of the copying task how transformers are better suited for certain tasks than GSSMs. While other studies have shown transformers' ability to use the full context for tasks like retrieval and question answering, our work adds to the understanding of how transformers and GSSMs compare on these tasks. We also explored how well models can generalize to different lengths of input, which helps us understand if they're solving tasks in the right way. Previous research on transformers has looked at how they handle different data distributions, use positional information, and solve arithmetic tasks. We've extended these ideas to the copying task. Finally, it's worth mentioning that there are tasks where GSSMs perform better than transformers. For example, transformers struggle with certain types of language modeling that LSTMs can handle easily. These tasks involve keeping track of a small amount of information over time. GSSMs can also handle very long contexts, like DNA sequences, which might be impractical for transformers. Section summary. The section discusses how pre-trained transformers outperform pre-trained GSSMs in copying long natural language strings, indicating an architectural bias of transformers that makes it easier for them to copy from the context. The experiments also show that in retrieval tasks requiring access to the whole context, GSSMs struggle to store relevant information in their fixed size state, as demonstrated in the phone book lookup and question answering experiments. This highlights the limitations of GSSMs in tasks that demand access to extensive context, while transformers maintain performance even for longer texts. Section: Discussion. We've shown through both theory and practical experiments that transformers excel at replicating elements from their input context better than generalized state space models, GSSMs. However, we want to highlight that GSSMs have several benefits over transformers. One of the key advantages is that the memory and computational demands of GSSMs don't grow with the length of the input. This makes them particularly efficient for training and running models on lengthy inputs. Moreover, state space models, like recurrent neural networks, RNNs, are more adept at maintaining and tracking state variables over extended sequences. This capability is crucial for creating long, coherent texts. Interestingly, the way the human brain processes language seems to align more closely with the workings of state space models. Therefore, we believe future research should concentrate on developing hybrid models. These models would combine the strengths of state space models with an attention mechanism similar to that found in transformers. This would enable them to pull relevant pieces of text from their inputs effectively. It's worth noting that while humans have a relatively limited ability to remember sequences, we can translate entire novels when given the chance to refer back to the text. We'd like to express our gratitude to Boaz Barak for his valuable insights. The computing resources from the Kempner Institute were instrumental in our research. We also acknowledge the financial support received by Sami Jalassi from the Center of Mathematical Sciences and Applications. The Kempner Institute for the Study of Natural and Artificial Intelligence was established partly thanks to a generous donation from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative Foundation. Additionally, Sham Kakad's research received funding from the Office of Naval Research under the award number N0001422122377.